Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Step Into the Pivot. We're so happy to have you here. And we are so happy to have our guest today, Morgan Rysdon. So, hi, Morgan. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Good. We're excited to have you here. So, I'm going to let Ivana do the intro of Morgan. So, Ivana, it's all yours.
Hello, Morgan. So great to see you here. Welcome. And for listeners and watchers who are taking a look at our episode today on YouTube, you might see that I am already readjusting my posture here, simply being in Morgan's presence. Morgan, we met during the pandemic where a mutual friend organized a really wonderful event online to teach women how to be more relaxed and yet in more poise at their desks. We were all transitioning during that time to, Zoom full time. Remote meetings became the reality, and sitting at the desk in this new way, facing the screen, was all of a sudden the new normal. And we were all having all kinds of physical, I think, discomfort because of that. And then you showed up in my life and started talking about how we can make ourselves more comfortable. And you showed a couple of really cool adjustments we can make at the desk. And so now, as soon as I see you, I'm like, am I doing it? Am I sitting up straight? What's going on here? This is because you're an Alexander Technique teacher. And that is something we're looking forward to finding out more about as we continue our conversation today. But what I would love to start with is, your story that precedes you finding Alexander Technique. And you shared a couple of really massive pivots with me in this, really, oh my gosh, like integrated way. I can tell when you talk about them that you have found a way to heal and transform some, pretty immense experiences. Are you open to sharing with our listeners what it is that I'm talking about? Some of these major pivots that have shaped your life?
Yeah, I'm not very shy about things that have happened to me in my life. And in fact, you know, when it started when I was 8, actually, and I was molested by a family member. And my parents had left us in the care of this individual. And even right after it happened, I remember running downstairs and telling my brother as he was taking out the trash, hey, this thing just happened. And my brother was like, stop making things up. And then he hit the garage door and he walked to school. And so I feel like from a very early age, I've always been really comfortable sharing the things that have happened to me and also knowing intrinsically that things are not my fault and things happen, unfortunately. And I think back and even, you know, when this event happened, of course, you say no, you say stop, you say, that you're not comfortable with something, and then somebody does it anyway, right? And you're a child and this person is an adult and you sort of go someplace else so that you can live through this event, right? And it took me a long time before I shared this information with adults and, my parents and people in my life who were able to help me. Because my brother really kind of shut that down immediately. And so then I started to question myself a bit. But this was probably the first event that happened that I would say, robbed me of my innocence a little too early and showed me that it's not so it's not always so happy in life, right? There are things that happen to you that will really forever ingrain and imprint on you. And it was probably around 14, when I began to feel uncomfortable getting hugs from my dad and affection from people. And I remember asking my parents if I could go and see somebody to talk about it. And my mom, of course, was very happy to accommodate. And she said, yes, my mom and dad, put me in with a therapist. And shortly thereafter, maybe a month or two, it was not long. It was New Year's Eve and my brother died. So my only brother died of meningitis when we were on a family reunion in Nassau in the Bahamas. And he he got, I think they call it meningococcal, it attacks the spinal column, and he got very sick very quickly. He was not feeling very good at dinner, and by the morning time, he had died. And it was just my parents and I. All my other family had gone back states, and we had decided to stay in Nassau for an extra day. So it was just my immediate family. And this was, 3 days after my 15th birthday. And I remember, my mom waking me up in the middle of the, morning, like very early. And we had a flight to catch, but I remember her being like, no, you've got to go get somebody. You have to call the front desk. We need to get somebody here. Your brother's not doing very well. And at that point, he wasn't even able to really talk. Like, I was looking at him, and you could almost sense what was happening. And I remember my dad was trying to go get somebody, and my mom and I had to put his shirt on, and he couldn't even really like lift up his arm. And I looked over my brother's head to my mother, and I was like mouthing, is he gonna die? Like, intuitively I knew, like, this isn't right. Something is going awry. And because of the holidays, and maybe because of the resort we were on, by the time we made it to the front, entrance, there wasn't like an ambulance. My dad found a wheelchair that we could whisk him away, but we had to take a limousine to the emergency room. It was such a bizarre, and I remember the limo driver like throwing some fragrance back, like, oh, see if that will revive him. Like, maybe he thought my brother was under the influence, or I don't really know what was happening, but this whole thing was happening right before my eyes, almost like a show, right? Like in slow motion. And um, and by the time we got to the hospital, I mean, my dad had already begun doing CPR because my brother had stopped breathing. And when we got there, nobody opened the doors. They were all locked. It was very strange. I was like pounding on the doors to try and get someone, as my mom and dad were caring to my brother. And of course, he had already passed away. He was only 17. He was my only sibling. And it was just and I remember when I came back home, going back to school, and I didn't really want to share this with people because I thought, surely they're going to say I'm a liar about this. Like, this seems so, so outrageous. Of course, obviously people knew that my brother had died. They made an announcement and such, but not all of the details surrounding this. And I think back to it, and I remember, I think it was maybe where I was a freshman and my brother was a senior, and it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks after that. And I had this sort of like theater thespian thing that as a freshman, I was sort of this fallback person. And all of a sudden they said, oh, you get to go to the state theater something. And my mom said, yes, it's okay. You can go. And as a parent now, I'm like, oh my God, my mom, are you kidding? I wouldn't have let me out of my sight. Now as a parent, I really think about I guess the bravery and courage really of my parents to still let me live, even though this event had happened, and I remember at one point teasing my parents because my mom and dad were in a car accident when they were younger. Before I was born, they were hit by a drunk driver when they were on a motorcycle. So my mom is handicapped as a result. She limps. And I always tease my parents. I'm like, you got married at 19. You were high school sweethearts since you were 16. Like, you should have gotten divorced because of that. You should have gotten divorced because of the accident. You should have gotten divorced. And my parents are very happily married, vacationing in Australia right now for 2 months. They're just, they've shown me that you can still survive these events that have happened in your life. And, ever since I think, my adolescence, I have really woken up to the fact that life is short. You do not know what's going to happen, and you can't take anything for granted. And really, living is a choice. Because I remember being in that emergency room, and I thought to myself, which I don't know what this says about me, but I remember thinking, if I decided to be the kind of teenager that drank and did drugs and had sex and did all these things, nobody would wonder why. Like, people would really be like, yeah, so much has happened to that girl, And I remember in that moment deciding, like, that's too simple. Like, that's what they expect from me. And I'm going to find a way to really like be happy and to really choose to survive these events. And I remember thinking that even though, of course, anger, all the steps of grief did reveal themselves in due time, but I do remember making sort of this very high level conscious decision that like I will get through this very hard thing.
I love that you talk about that because I think people like come across that frequently. Like I know we've talked about it before on Step Into the Pivot. I know I had that when I had breast cancer, right? You make that decision to continue on and to live the best life. And all those things are terrible things that happen in your world, but I love that they got you help. I love that they got you somebody to talk to. I love all those things. And I also love that you made that decision to really make sure that you were living that you're living your life, right? And also, your comment about your mom like letting you go, but I think she recognized that too, that you were still a teenager and you needed to have a life, right? You couldn't just sit back there and think about that and do nothing else. So
Well,
that's what I got from what you said, Morgan.
and you
So,
know what, Teresa, the universe had a snowstorm and nobody could go. So
oh,
interesting. So I remember all of a sudden, all of these seniors ended up at my house watching these Audrey Hepburn movies. And I think they knew like my situation and like we should be at this family's home. And
yep.
so it did work out in the end as well. And, in my mom's case. And I don't want to fool anybody. As soon as we got back from that trip, I did, the therapy changed and I did quit. I did not stay in therapy. I was very sort of like, I can do this on my own. And, my parents again let me sort of decide and they followed my lead. But I shut down for a long time and I avoided therapy for a number of years before I finally, went back in my mid 20s. But I didn't want to talk about it. I kind of wanted to like push through, but I was like, yeah, not going to deal with it, you know? But we'll continue to show up, but we'll avoid
Yeah.
doing the
Yeah.
hard, I suppose.
Yeah. Even I know you wanted to say something. I
Well,
can
I
see
was
I can see you thinking.
well, I'm noticing, in that part about your mom saying that you can go. So even though there's a snowstorm, right, and you don't end up going, there's something going on there that almost, foreshadows what is your life, and living your life on purpose. And maybe your mom is tuning into that. So you mentioned that this is, the thespian context, so acting, so stage. Can you take us there? Can you take us into that,
Yeah.
that realm and chapter and how that relates to what you're doing today with regards to Alexander technique
Yeah.
and all
So
of that, the context of healing?
that's yes. So of course I dove into extracurriculars to submerge myself in the emotions and feelings of other characters, which was very effective, to be quite honest. But also it was a tactic of avoidance. Now I see back, right? And when I had gone to college, I pursued a degree in theater. My bachelor's is in performance art. And it was probably my freshman year that I met a movement instructor, Paul Denhart, and he was my movement stage combat, and he was pursuing an Alexander Technique certification program. And I didn't really know anything about that. I didn't know, I'd never heard of the word, I didn't understand. And he did this simple exercise in class. I remember we were standing in front of sort of these ballet mirrors, and he took us through a simple movement of like one arm up, one arm down. And I just remember looking in the mirror and like one shoulder was super high and the other one was really low. And I was like, well, this is weird. And he didn't touch any of us. He didn't, he didn't manipulate it. He talked us through an exercise of movement that we did to ourselves. And it caught my attention and it definitely piqued my curiosity because I was confused and I was like, what is going on? So he needed some students to work on his own practice of utilizing his hands as a teacher because he was in his certification program. And that program is 3 years. It's over 1,600 hours. It's very intense. And I remember when I would go see him, he didn't do a lot of talking. He would put his hands on me in a very gentle way, either in and out of a chair or on a massage table. And I remember not really understanding what was happening in the moment, but feeling this sort of weight that I had had on my body for what I perceived to be my entire life. Like all of a sudden it was levitated off of me. and I felt like I could breathe. It was like air came in and I was like, oh, wow, like, whoa, thank you for carrying that weight that I didn't even know was sitting on my heart and on my body and really just suffocating me. And was purely it was exhausting, actually. I suffered from a lot of anxiety and a lot of feelings of sadness. I wouldn't say I was depressed, but I definitely struggled. It was hard to show up the way that I knew I wanted to because it was conflicting with how my body was living, if that makes sense. So intellectually and emotionally, maybe I was available, but my body physically was not able to do that sort of thing. So I knew when I graduated from college that I would want to explore this thing called Alexander Technique. And so I started with lessons with a teacher in Chicago. When my husband moved us to New Haven when he was pursuing his master's, I ended up working with a teacher there in New Haven. And then ultimately I decided to pursue my training program in Manhattan. So it was the oldest training program, ACAT, the American Center for the Alexander Technique. And when I started this training program, I still am going to be quite honest, I still didn't understand. I knew how I felt, but I didn't know the level of responsibility that I had with that experience. And with that teacher program, I really kind of came full circle and was like, oh my gosh, I can do this myself, not just as a teacher, but as the student, right? And I remember when I graduated feeling really upset about the fact that not any one of my four teachers I had ever explicitly explained to me how you're feeling is not because of me. It is because of the work you're doing with me. And I remember getting very mad and like, oh, my teachers. And probably 3 or 4 years into my practice, I realized, oh, no, no, no. Oh, no, I'm the common denominator. I had all these different teachers and not one of them said anything. Like, what is it about me that they saw and observed? And I realized if they had told me it was more work, I wouldn't have done it. I really would have quit actually because I didn't want to do a lot of that stuff. So it was really interesting, this sort of arrival to the awareness of how I can take care of myself and how I can help calm my nervous system down and experience myself differently. And that's when I really saw my body start to shift and change. Old pictures of me in the past, I had very horrible habits around poor posture. My head was very far forward. You could never see my neck. I was slouched. I was really like hiding. And when you look at them, you can kind of see like she's pretty sad and she looks like she probably suffers from anxiety. You can see it now that I reflect on that. But it's interesting because then my body started to really shift and change.
So what can our guests do, right, when they have those things? Are there some very simple tips you could share with some of our guests who are listening that I'd love to hear them because I haven't heard them before. So do you mind sharing just a few very simple things?
Of course not. No, in fact, even a nose. This is when you're gonna have to stop me because I just go into teacher mode and then I like you can't. But the simplest thing that I always tell individuals is things like constructive rest, which is probably the only like exercise that you'll ever hear an Alexander teacher talk about. And that's where you get a couple of books on the floor with a yoga mat in a quiet space and you just lie down. Now, I have plenty of videos on YouTube about this, and I'm sure you can share with your community, but this is a way that you're going to remove all the outside stimuli. So no, distractions, no conversations, you're not thinking about other things. You're just tuning in to how does my body feel? And some people find this very restful and very restorative, and other people get fidgety. Some people don't like it. They don't like to quiet themselves down. And there's no right answer. It's just something that you can do to begin practicing getting in touch with what is actually happening. The same thing with using mirrors. We oftentimes, I would say, misuse mirrors in the sense that we're using them to sort of, fix ourselves and make sure everything is right. And really, you can use mirrors to see like, oh, why is my head always crooked when I'm listening to Teresa? Or why am I shoving my jaw forward as I'm, confused, or I'm shaking my head a lot and I do have a lot of neck pain, so like
Yeah.
you can start to use mirrors or even reflections when you're walking down the street, if you happen to be in a city and you catch a glimpse of yourself. And, I always tell people pause and try to resist the temptation of the strong habit of judgment and instead tune into curiosity.
I love that. And you know what I was thinking as you were talking about that was like in that pre-COVID world, we would have never sat on the Zoom call. Nobody wanted to be on. Nobody wanted to be showing this or sharing this. And now it's kind of commonplace, but you've had to learn how not to judge yourself, how not to like, so it's very interesting, Morgan. It kind of came a little full circle for me there, but I loved what you had to say. So I think that's amazing. Ivana, I
Yeah.
know.
Well, I think I can give a personal example of what you're talking about here, where how it all connects. So, for example, one of the things you helped me catch, Morgan, is my turtleneck. So I'll do this thing. So if you're watching, you can see that I'm like sticking out my jaw and then I'm like going out of my shell. And if first of all, if I'm unconscious about that, it will happen throughout the day, throughout all of my calls. By the end of the day, I'll have shoulder tension, neck tension. I will just feel so exhausted. If I apply principles of inner work, if I do some inner bonding on this, if I have a conversation with somebody like you guys, either one of you, and I start tuning into why this is happening, I can catch at least two things going on. One is technical. It's eyesight related. Sometimes I can't see as well as I would like to. I don't want to interrupt the flow. So, for example, like right now, it's really comfortable for me to be without my glasses. But if I want to take a closer look at, where's the mute and unmute button on Zoom, it would actually be a good idea to put my glasses on, and then I wouldn't do the turtleneck. So there's this like technical piece about it that I can adjust. And like, even I just put your freaking glasses on and then you don't have to do the turtleneck. But if I keep going, I'll find that there's a deeper layer. And here's Morgan, where we're starting to go into that space of your history and the important stories that you shared, which is that I have a tendency that does not come from a very high place. It comes from kind of from fear, really, to make sure that people are okay. Is everybody okay? Are you okay, Morgan? Are you okay as we're interviewing you? Teresa, are you okay? Are we okay? Are we on time? How is it going? And there's this like posture of like, how are we? How are we doing? That is causing this turtleneck to happen if I don't catch it. So then it's like, whoa, stop that. Come here. Let's
Yeah.
So Morgan, does that resonate? And as you're thinking about that, maybe you can start helping us, conclude. We
I
covered
think
so much here.
Well, and I think the thing that I always tell people, there are these sayings that I think are very rich and applicable, like this idea of have a backbone, have a spine. And it's this idea of like coming back to yourself and not feeling the need to come forward. And these habits are going to happen. I sometimes people get really critical, and I try to keep the work, at least in my practice, very fun and non-judgmental and playful even. When you find yourself messing up, in your case, if your neck is coming a little forward and you find that turtleneck sort of happening, it's like smile about it because you're catching it. So you're already, in my opinion, you're already ahead, right? And the more that you can remind yourself of your ability to either technically, yes, there are alternatives. If I need to get something, I don't have to stay on my chair and reach my shoulder that's already giving me some problems. I could actually stand up and go across and pick something up, right? There's very technical things that people can start to adjust and shift to make their life more, comfortable. But then it's also tuning into what are the needs that I have? Because a simple question of, is everyone doing okay? And if not, in the chat box, can you just let me know and I'll keep an eye on it? It's like, how can I meet my need, but not at my expense,
Mhm.
right? And that I think is something that oftentimes we don't always take the time to sort of reflect on. And I don't think in our society in general, we're asking people to pause long enough and think about that for themselves, right? But the more that we do that work for ourselves, the more we can share it with our colleagues and our family and friends, and we can support people taking better care of themselves, whether it's at a dinner party like Thanksgiving just happened. So, or the holidays just happened, right? And so we have these opportunities to say when people come to our house, listen, if the temperature is not good, I've got a whole bunch of blankets over here. I can turn a fan on for you. If you need some slippers, helping people to feel more comfortable so that they can take better care of themselves in different situations.
Yeah, awesome. We will definitely put the link to your YouTube because I'm very interested in watching them myself. I need that disconnect time and I don't take it enough for myself. So I love that. So can you kind of come full circle with this for us, like kind of wrap this together? We always ask, how is this pivot a step forward? And I'd love to kind of hear you, that Alexander technique, how that kind of moved you forward from these other life events that we started off this conversation of. Can you tie that together for our listeners?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, nobody is more invested in your recovery and your healing than yourself. And so often, I think we go to people outside of ourselves looking for answers, which can be very helpful. But in the end, the true help is going to be an inward work. It's going to be something that we have to learn how to do for ourselves. And good teachers, right? Good practitioners, good therapists, good, having people who have either done the journey a little bit ahead of you are going to help make it easier for you. So I always tell my students, I mean, it's not, I'm just a little higher on the staircase. You're a little bit behind me. And my teachers are even further up, right? And our life is ever evolving and ever changing. And so the more that you learn how to think about the things that you've experienced as opportunities for you to reflect and think about what habits have I had. In my case, I realized my pain was internal. A lot of my students come to me with physical pain, to be honest. They have back pain, neck pain, shoulder problems, repetitive stress injury. The list is long, right? Mine was more internal, as I call it. And both of those things, though, have habits around them. Mine were my habits to swallow myself up and try to make people happy and not giving myself the time and space I needed to stop and think about what would actually make me feel better. And I think people who are in pain start to develop habits around, oh, let's say you have a bad knee. I've started to avoid bending it too much. And now I've got a hip problem. So one thing can lead to another. And if we're not taking the time to reflect on those things, we don't have the opportunity, to change things and to make sure that do these habits still serve me? Are they still necessary? Are they still important? And those needs can change, right? I actually don't even know if I answered your question, but that's where my brain took me.
I think you totally answered it. I think that your answer was right on. I mean, I think that's absolutely true.
100%, Morgan. Thank you so much for the shares. There is so much power and bravery that you demonstrated here throughout this whole conversation. And I feel that you actually answered the question about how this pivot was a step forward very early on when you said these two beautiful gems. You said, tomorrow is not promised. You didn't say it like that. I'm paraphrasing, but you were talking about like nothing, it's not guaranteed. The experiences you had showed you that you don't know what the next moment is bringing. And the fact that, we may not be here tomorrow. It's not guaranteed. So tomorrow's not promised. The other thing you said that is a quote is you said living is a choice. And I think those two, when you put them side by side, can be a paradox, but they're not. That is how these, pivots are a transformative experience. They show us that tomorrow's not promised and, living and thriving is a choice. So thank you so much, Morgan.
Oh, thank
Yes.
you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Morgan. I think this was some very a great, a not so great story that turned into a great ending. And even I love the way you summed that up because I totally agree with you on both those points. So thank you again, Morgan. Thank you to our listeners for being here today. We really appreciate it. And remember, if you have a pivot, step into it.
I threw